Dogon truth.
Priestly modern-day African tribe. They're outwardly primitive, and they are from Mali, which is a country in the northwest bulge of Africa. And in my opinion, the Dogon tribe, for anybody who is interested in ancient symbols or ancient religion and what it all means, the Dogon are a great untapped resource.
The word Dog, which really mean land or country or whatever. So originally, a Dogon would have meant like a landlord. So in the ancient time or the times of the pharaohs, being a Dogon would mean like, you know, being a descendant of the line of the priest, those who preserve the spiritual activities, the ceremonies, the, you know, everything that had to do with.
What makes the Dogon different is a unique social harmony maintained by strong tradition. Among these people, murder, theft, and suicide is all but unknown. Greed is rare. Disputes are settled by debate in open forum. A goat has broken down a neighbor's wall and damaged his crops. The farmer demands repayment. The goat's owner insists it is the farmer's fault. He should have built a better wall. The elders decide that indeed the wall should be stronger, that both men should rebuild it and replant the crop.
The thing that brought the Dogon to the attention of the public was the fact that they seemed to know some things about astronomy that they shouldn't know without having powerful telescopes. They knew that the Sirius star system involved two stars, not one, and that one of them was a very tiny dwarf star, and they knew that the orbital period of the two stars for each other, among other things. And so I began to pursue that, and I discovered that that's just really the tip of it.
The hum of the bull roar is believed to be the voice of the sacred star. It calls initiates to a ceremony high in the cliffs. Dating back to a time when the Western world was locked in the Dark Ages, this ritual has taken place year after year. During the ceremony, the full spectrum of Dogon knowledge is revealed and passes from generation to generation. A circle within a circle depicts Saturn and its rings, which can only be seen with a telescope. A large circle and 4 satellites. The planet Jupiter and its moons. Most remarkable is this symbol. It represents the orbit of the Dogon star, a phenomenon deep in stellar space. Yet, no such orbiting star is visible from the Earth. It was not until this century that Western astronomers began to suspect its existence.
A desert tribe called the Dogon, isolated in the African wilderness, may have identified a star invisible to the unaided eye. How is this possible? How could the Dogon possess this sophisticated astronomical information?
Tribal legend tells us that beings called Numo descended from the sacred star and appeared before the Dogon ancestors. The Dogon were entrusted by the Numo with 366 symbols, given without meaning. The Dogon were charged with interpreting them and preserving the information for future generations. The symbols reveal an astonishing scope of astronomical knowledge, an infinite number of stars and spiraling worlds. After more than 5 years among the Dogon people, Dr. Guggenheim has gradually gained the confidence of the Dogon elders and acceptance into the inner circle of secret knowledge.
The Dogon believe the universe was born in a vast explosion, and as it opened up, everything that we know about and everything that the Dogon know about in the world came pouring out, and nothing was left except a shell. This empty shell became the star that they call the Pontolo, and that we call Sirius B.
In 1950, astronomers confirmed the existence of the Dogon star. At the United States Naval Observatory, Washington, D.C., Chief Astronomer Dr. Irving Lindenblad devoted years to the search for the dark star.
The Sirius system is a very interesting challenge observationally because it is very difficult to observe a star 10 seconds from such a bright object as Sirius A.
After the years of effort, Dr. Lindenblad finally succeeded in taking this photograph of Sirius B and its giant companion. The Dogon possess even more startling information about the star they hold sacred. They say that when it gave forth all its energy, it collapsed in upon itself, becoming incredibly dense and so heavy that all the earthly beings combined cannot lift it. The San Fernando Observatory, Sylmar, California. Dr. Gary Chapman is an astronomer specializing in the physical characteristics of stars. By splitting the light collected from a distant star into colored bands, its physical characteristics can be analyzed.
The Sirius B is fairly normal in the surface layers, but we do rely on the calculations to tell us that the interior is essentially out of nuclear fuel. It's a dead star. We know from modern calculations that it has a very, very high density, has a density about 5 million times that of water, and if you were to be on the surface of Sirius B right now, you'd be crushed very, very flat because the surface gravity is about 100 million times that of the Earth.
What I noticed was the Dogon priests say that that their religion describes how their tribal god created matter. And I could see that they had the definition of an atom right, and I could see that they had the definition of neutrons, protons, and electrons right. And that made me wonder if maybe the descending levels of the creation of matter could also be right. And so I started educating myself, reading, Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene, and trying to come to an understanding of how science thinks matter is created. And in this first book, The Science of the Dogon, one of the things I do is I lay side by side the Dogon description of the stage of matter with a description from Hawking or Greene, and the Dogon drawing that goes with that side by side with a diagram from Hawking or Greene, and show that the systems are the same, that the Dogon have it absolutely right. And to some extent, the Dogon actually go farther than science does. Science doesn't try to address the process, the problem of how is it that matter behaves like a wave to begin with, and then after it's perceived, it behaves like a particle. But the Dogon do.
Brian Greene and Stephen Hawking don't talk about how is it, what is it that causes an active perception to change matter in its wave-like state into particles. Nobody really has a theory about what makes that happen. How is it that we can just look at something and have the act of looking at it or perceiving it change it from waves into particles? They have experiments that show this happens. They can't explain why it happens. Well, from the Dogon perspective, matter begins with the shape on the left-hand side. It begins with the circle with the dot in the middle of it, which they call the egg in the ball, or the womb of all world signs, or the picture of Amma. And they conceptualize it in relation to the four classical elements of water, fire, wind, and earth. But the way they explain it, those symbols represent categories of, how can I say this? These are if you imagine many stages of creation, these are they break them down into four separate segments. They represent four segments of the processes of creation. Water is matter in its wave-like state. Fire is the act of perception that causes it to change. Wind is vibration, and earth is mass. This is one of a series of four-stage metaphors that the Egyptians or the Dogon give us to help us understand their symbols, because the symbolism starts to become so complicated that you can't put it together. What does a symbol represent? Well, by giving us these metaphors, we know that anytime they're talking about something connected to water, they're talking about initial stages of creation. If they're talking about things related to earth, they're talking about the final stages of creation. That's one metaphor to help us explain it.
Two French anthropologists, a man by the name of Marcel Griaule, who was the foremost anthropologist of his day, and his student, whose name was Germaine Dieterlen. And they spent the better part of 30 years, starting in 1930, living among the Dogon and researching them and filming them and interviewing them and studying every aspect of their religion and documenting it. And they produced a work called The Pale Fox, which is the definitive statement about what the Dogon religion is and what it means. And that's one of my primary resources. Now, I have an advantage over Temple in that at the time Temple wrote that anthropological study hadn't been translated from French into English, and he only had a partial translation of small pieces of it, whereas I was able to work from the entire translated.
Information.
Yes.
They don't do anything with it?
Yes, yeah. Yes, they did. According to the Dogon and the underlying philosophies of the tradition, there are two purposes here. The first purpose is to make us aware of what our true relationship is to the larger processes of creation. Okay, from the modern perspective, humanity is the end-all of all processes of creation. We're the top of the chain. That promotes a certain perspective among us as to what our role is in relation to the rest of nature. With a true understanding of the way the processes work, we realize that we're only another step along that chain. The chain continues up beyond us to Barnard's Loop and to places like that. We're nowhere near the top of it. We're just another step along the chain. And looked at in that way, our whole orientation to how we ought to behave in relation to those processes changes. Okay, the second purpose is, we're expected, the hope is that having this knowledge, that we will develop what is referred to as discriminating knowledge.